Welcome to Foreign Countries, Conversations in Archaeology with me, Ash Lenton. This episode is about the huge social changes that occurred in Central Europe in the latter half of the Neolithic. Later on, I'll be talking to Dr. Anna Grabungia about the development and spread of textile technology. But first, I'm joined by Dr. Nils Müller-Scheeßel of Kiel University. Nils was a co-author on an Antiquity paper on fairly dramatic new burial rites at the end of the Linearbandkeramik. So welcome, Nils. Can we start with some context? This paper came out of a significant research project.
The project within the paper is called the Dynamics of Settlement Concentration Processes and Land Use in Early Farming Communities of the Northwestern Carpathian Basin. And it's important to know that this is part of a much larger endeavor. In Germany, we have collaborative research centers. These are meant to further interdisciplinary work. And so there are 50 plus scientists working on this whole CRC. This CRC is called Scales of Transformation. The background is that the CRC wants to analyze changes in prehistory, and there are many sub-projects. And one of these is the one I'm talking about.
And how long does the project run for?
This whole CRC is planned for 12 years, and after each 4 years, there will be an evaluation. The whole thing started in 2016. The first evaluation was in 2020, so it's now the second phase, and hopefully it will be prolonged for a third phase.
And what is the sub-project?
And the sub-project is dealing with diachronically with changes in a certain region, which is southwestern Slovakia. And we started the first 4 years, starting with the first settlers, the first farming communities in this region, which is so-called Linearbandkeramik, LBK. And the second phase afterwards is dealing with younger periods. So we have for one region, transformations, the changes in society for around 3,000 years. The speciality here in Kiel University is a very close connection between archaeology and the natural sciences. For historic reasons, and this is also the specialty of the CRC and the sub-project, that we have a close collaboration between archaeologists, as if you want, humanities, and the natural sciences like geologists, anthropologists, but also ADNA specialists, isotope, the whole thing which is nowadays employed.
And why this geographic region?
The reason why southwestern Slovakia was chosen was dependent on several grounds. There's a close cooperation for decades now with colleagues in Eastern Europe. Then there was a chance discovery. In 2009 and 10, colleagues of the German Archaeological Institute were also doing a project there in southwestern Slovakia at the place of Vráblein, and they did large-scale magnetic prospection to an area of more than 1 square kilometer. They focused on a Bronze Age settlement, but they also found traces of other periods, for example, a Roman campsite, but also 3 settlement agglomerations of the Linearbandkeramik, the LBK. That was when this idea was born to look at this area diachronically from the LBK to the Bronze Age, because we have in the LBK a very large settlement agglomeration, which is not completely unknown, but it's 30 hectares and it is much larger than the normal LBK settlement. And then at the Bronze Age, the same process is obviously happening again. There was a settlement agglomeration of probably more than 1,000 inhabitants. And so this was a background idea to study these processes, which are not exactly repeating, but at the surface at least look similar on different levels. So the social level, but also environmental level, and to try to find reasons for this development.
So you moved on from survey to excavations?
Research there started in 2010 with first test trenches, then small scale excavations 2012 and 13-14, and then in earnest in 2016 with the start of the CRC, with larger scale excavations. And these excavations were first targeting different areas of the settlement site and several houses to find out about the chronology and perhaps differences between the settlement agglomerations inside.
Can you just set the scene for the time period?
Perhaps I have to say a little bit about the LBK in general. What is fascinating about the LBK, it's in Central Europe, it's the first farming communities. Farming came from Anatolia, then it reached southeastern Europe, and then this development ended for 1,000 years. And then around 5,400 BC, suddenly, archaeologically speaking, with a blink of an eye, the LBK spread. It's really hard to trace the founding of these settlements because they are appearing virtually everywhere, from France to Ukraine. And this is really fascinating. I mean, why they spread and how they did it so fast. The LBK package contains distinct material culture, like the houses. They are very easily recognizable. The pottery, the naming, giving pottery, Linearbandkeramik, so they are, in the later phases, they are nicely incised bands, usually simple forms. They look not exactly the same, but they at least look similar from France to Ukraine. And then there are also the stone implements, which are also very similar everywhere. Not only did they spread very fast, but they continued during their existence to maintain their relationship between each other. The villages were not self-contained. There were long-distance, long-range relations maintained by the people. And this is also visible in some kinds of material cultures, because there are some variabilities and suddenly things pop up, which are, for example, belonging to Slovakia, popping up in Western Germany or so.
So this site at Vráblein is undoubtedly LBK, but I think it's quite extraordinary in many ways, isn't it?
What is striking about these three settlement agglomerations, right? I mean, the LBK houses are very distinct, even in geophysical imagery. So you only have to see these double ditches and you know this is an LBK house. So you can identify houses and the settlement layout very, very easily. And each of these agglomerations looked like a settlement at its own. They are on a plain and each around 100 houses. And there was a question, how do these three agglomerations relate to each other? And the first idea was obviously that they perhaps are superseding each other. But during the excavation, we found out that they are actually contemporaneous. And this really poses the question, how can this be and why? Each look very similar. The size is very similar.
And what would you expect to find in the funerary context?
We know lots of regular cemeteries of the LBK, for example, in Germany, but also in Slovakia, there's one large cemetery, about 70 burials, where you observe a recurring pattern. The people are lying on the left side and they have burial goods, mostly pottery, some stone implements, aces, sometimes ochre. This was usually impression one had for decades of the LBK customs burying the dead. On the other hand, even if you have to take into account that burials have been destroyed, of course, during the last millennia, they are not enough if we think of how many people probably died during the 400 years of existence of the LBK. But this question was never asked really, how the rest was treated. This has only changed in the last 30 years because several sites were discovered. There was a completely different treatment of the dead. So there are several iconic sites, Thalheim, Haxheim, southwestern Germany, and Aspern-Schletz in Austria. Thalheim is a massacre site where people were killed. I mean, you see the traces on the bones from behind. So it was really, it was not a fight, it was a massacre. In Haxheim, you see dismemberment of people, probably of dead bodies, and then they were scattered out in an enclosure. In Aspern-Schletz, on the other hand, you have traces of violence again on the bodies, of bodies lying in a ditch of an enclosure. And so the story of the last 30 years was that because these sites all date towards the end of the LBK, that there was a state of crisis of the LBK, so that the LBK way of life was not longer sustainable. And here Vráblein comes into play.
Right, so what's the significance of the burials at Vráblein?
I think it's fair to say that it's on its way to be another iconic site where we can find alternative ways of treating the dead. At Vráblein in 2017, we wanted to excavate 2 entrances to the site, and there we encountered human bodies in the ditch and around the ditch and in the entrance itself. Scientific dating later established that they date to around 5050 before Christ to around 4975. And this is also at the end of the Vráblein site. But we found different ways of how the people treated. So on the one hand, we found also regular burials, not in a cemetery like in Nitra, but around one of the entrances. And the typical way, people lying on the side in a crouched position with burial goods. So this was how we would expect it. And then again, in the ditch itself, several individuals which were not treated in this way. And this was then the reason for the new burial rites, because what we found there were dead bodies without head.
The heads were missing.
So the skull was missing. We found it at least in 2017 for individuals where this pattern occurred. So it was not done by chance. And there were additional excavations this year. And indeed, we found more skeletons of this kind without skull. In this sense, the paper is still valid. The first question was, of course, when we found these individuals, why, but also how and when.
So could you describe the scene?
The individuals were lying on the bottom of the ditch. They looked like if they have been thrown into the ditch. There were no signs on the vertebrae next to the skull that the skull was removed when the flesh was still on the bone. So there were no cut marks. And this implies that the skull was removed when the ligaments was not strong to hold the skull to the rest of the body.
Somebody went round after and collected up the heads.
Yeah, I would say at least several weeks, but a few months after deposition. The bodies were probably not complete skeletonized because also the mandibula was missing and the first vertebra. So there was probably still some flesh around the head. So it's quite gruesome, to be honest.
It is quite gruesome. How are you interpreting these finds?
We have developed some hypotheses, and it will be interesting to see how the data we got from the new excavation will relate to this. There's different fields of interpretation we have to take into account. Of course, on the one hand, you have this regular burial, which speaks for investment, care. 2 of the burials which were most lavishly equipped were both older males. So this would all fit into a story where we have a status related to age and perhaps also achievement. The placement of the individuals in the ditches speaks for less investment. On the other hand, the head removal is reminding of head trophy or veneration of ancestors. In 2017, one of the individuals was a 6-year-old child, which makes thinking of an ancestor without a head a bit difficult. In 2017, there were only a few individuals, so there is no chance to get any statistical valid data. There was something which is not being published in the Antiquity paper because there was too little information. Interesting differences between the individuals in the ditches and the individuals in the regular burials in terms of nitrogen values.
And what might that mean?
This points to perhaps different living conditions. The intriguing part of the whole story is the 3 settlement clusters. Only one of them, the southwestern one, has an enclosure with the ditch where we found the bodies. It's a double ditch system with probably a palisade in the inside. And they are contemporaneous, as I said. However, this enclosure has several entrances, but none points to the other 2 settlements. So the idea we have is that, these 3 exhumations were contemporaneous, and they were due to social cooperation, but also social competition, that there were tensions between them. And one of the means to get these tensions into to grapple with them was this building of an enclosure around the southwestern settlement. And if you take the chronology into account, this probably happened around 5075, perhaps. So in a sense, this was really worked out because it took another 70, 80 years until the settlement dissolved. And this process happened later in Slovakia as, for example, in Germany, the end of the LBK.
So the LBK in Vráblein was ending or changing differently to the LBK in Germany?
The end of the settlement and the dispersion of LBK happened 80 years after, 3-4 generations after this building of the enclosure. So it might have really helped the LBK society dissolved in Vráblein later than elsewhere. So that this means for dealing these tensions, inner societal tensions, was really successful in a way, not completely, but at least for several decades, several generations.
And the headless people?
We think that these headless individuals inside the ditch were also expression of these tensions, not necessarily in terms of violence. I mean, the sites I've talked about earlier, Herxheim, Aspern, they are all interpreted as sites where interpersonal violence was taking place. We don't have traces of deadly violence to the bodies. I mean, that does not mean that they were not killed, because many means of killing other people are not leaving traces on the skeleton, but at least there are no positive indications for that.
If it wasn't violent breakdown, what was it?
Our hypothesis is that there were positively tensions within these agglomeration, where there could be plenty of reasons. Competition for resources, for example. We have tried to estimate the population within the region, and it might have been close to overusage. The main resource for the LBK, they did agriculture or gardening, but the main resource is the cattle farming, and they need lots of land, and this might have been a problem. This different treatment we find in the burial record between the regular burials and the ones in the ditches could speak in favor of competition for resources and different treatments of people in life, as perhaps in the isotope values, and then in dead afterwards as well. The intriguing question is why removing the heads? I mean, it's, even if the people were already dead, it's still an act of violence to dead bodies. We don't have a definite answer to that, why the head were removed and what they did afterwards with that. Yes, it's intriguing. And I hope that because of the new data we got this year and perhaps in some succeeding years as well, that we can shed more light on this.
Are you able to address those questions in the future?
One piece of evidence might be a DNA analysis. If we can establish genetic relationship between individuals but exclude from others, this would help in the interpretation. One possible interpretation is that some of these of the regular burials perhaps stem from the southwestern settlement, and the others might be from the other settlements.
And where does this research go next?
In the long term, we are looking also for the succeeding periods. The succeeding period is called Linearbandkeramik, and there's still settlements in the region, but more dispersed, human individuals, and we would like to know how this process from the dispersion of the LBK to the dissolvement of the LBK to the next phase worked out.
Thank you very much for talking to me, Nils Müller-Scheeßel. I'm joined now by Dr. Anna Grabungia of the Free University of Berlin to talk about the interaction of distant technologies across Neolithic Central Europe. With her co-authors, Anna published an Antiquity paper on a comparison of textile making technologies and the spread of wool production. So welcome, Anna. What were the questions you were asking in this paper?
It's basically a continuation of my previous research, because my PhD was focused on just exploring textile technology in mainly Southeastern Europe. And this took roughly 4 years, because the data from the period that I focused on and from the region was not analyzed, was not collected. I was sponsored by Topoi Excellence Cluster to do the research with the aim of finding early evidence of wool production. And this was quite challenging because the data set just didn't exist. So I spent roughly 2.5 years going around Southeastern Europe and documenting all the tools. And in the beginning, I started documenting everything that is connected to textile technology. But for the particular period that I was focusing on, which was mainly like 4th, 3rd, and the beginning of the 2nd millennium before Christ, spindle whorls just popped up everywhere as opposed to other artifacts connected to textile production. Pretty early on, I decided to focus only on spindle whorls.
So you were finding spindle whorls everywhere you looked. What was the scope of the evidence for the wool production?
This was a pretty large data set. I ended up with roughly 900 spindle whorls, having absolutely all the boxes checked so I can do my analysis. There was many more, but they were either in poor condition or their chronological attribution was questionable. Excavation methodology was not fitting my standard. So I ended up with 901, I think, exactly spindle whorls that really fit my standards. And then I did my analysis on that. And I think that was one of the biggest achievements of my research. I think I just introduced this body of material, of data to the region and to the period that was just not inspected or looked at before.
But you also looked at the great diversity of the tools.
In the continuation, I got another grant to do my postdoc. And then I thought, what can I do now? I'm very much interested to spread it a bit and to compare it to material from the same period, but from another region to see, okay, maybe some interesting differences appear and I can connect it to something. And then I got connected with the two main researchers that inspected these two wetland sites in the Alps. So Arbenbleich 3 and Thorvesen 2. The sites were very rich. The amount of data that I collected there was insane. And I'm very grateful because for someone who is into prehistory and Europe, these are really famous locations. And for a textile researcher in particular.
Yeah, is there a standardized methodology for studying textile tools?
The methodological framework for my entire research is based on the CTR's standards. So this is a Center for Textile Research in Copenhagen. I was in consultation with them when I started doing my PhD, and I find the methodology pretty concrete, and these are all measurements that give objective picture, and then the tools are also easy to compare amongst each other. I mean, we all like working with numbers when we want to make strict scientific statements. The weight as the parameter was, of course, always inspected, and then the dimensions. So diameter and height of the tools, and of course the shape.
Can you paint the picture for me? What are the spindle whorls like?
So this is something that differs always. Now, every researcher, someone will say, okay, this is conical. Someone will say, this is convex, concave conical. Someone will say, this looks like a trumpet. But I took drawings of every tool by hand, and I took photographs of every tool. And then later on, I did 3-dimensional models. So for my PhD, I actually did reconstruction of weight for spindle whorls that were fragmented. But for this particular paper, I decided, okay, no, we are gonna take only complete spindle whorls or spindle whorls that are preserved in half. So we're gonna have not reconstructed weight, but calculated weight, which is roughly double the weight of partial tool, which is preserved in half. The mistake there is negligible, I think.
Do they have recurring characteristics?
So yes, I mean, the toughest part was everyone that does this kind of investigation of spindle whorls kind of agrees that the diameter and height ratio is something that is very important because it really affects the speed of the rotation. So in this particular period, I didn't have a single spheric for example, spindle whorl and the sample. My spindle whorls were all either flat shaped, whether this was very flat lenticular or a discoid shape, or what some people call wheel-shaped spindle whorl, or they were some form of conical. Later on in my PhD data set, I had a bigger variety. I had biconical spindle whorls as well, but for this particular paper, the tools that were taken were mainly either some form of, so to say, flat-shaped or conical ones.
And did you find that particular spindle whorls were associated with particular people?
One of the most interesting things for me personally was the shape and the sizes are very cultural specific. I mean, this is also to be expected, but no one actually looked at it that way. No? And I was in Germany, and Germany is the mother of cultural historical approach. And I thought like, okay, this is very convenient. So early on, I saw that each culture has something that is unique, and you can see connections with different cultures, but you can recognize spindle whorls from one culture as opposed to another very early on if you look through enough of the data.
So are they associated with different communities of people?
The conical and the biconical shape is something that we see happening really with the onset of Baden culture. I knew if someone from the museum is going to give me sites that had Baden culture documented there, they're going to be conical, and then later on for coastal adds biconical spindle whorls. This popped out as a signature thing right away. And I was actually also not the only one that noticed this. There were some authors that were inspecting material in the region that also connected this shape of tool with Baden culture. And the two sites in pre-alpine region were very interesting for me, super interesting, because the researchers discovered that first, when they were doing their analysis, they found the material which is typical of Baden culture. But then later on, the analysis of clay proved that these were not imports. This is kind of like a normal thing. We have imports around everywhere, but there it was proved that the local inhabitants were actually doing their own thing, their own pottery. This was extremely interesting for me because I wanted to see, okay, they kept that part of technology. So probably what happened with textile production, were they also doing the things their own specific way, or there was more mingling going around?
Were the Baden tools very different from the Eastern European ones?
What is very typical about these two data sets, I mean, the material, the tools are very standardized. When you compare them to the Eastern European data set, the amount of standardization is super obvious. This is to be expected. I mean, these sites were very short-lived. One was, I think, 14 years and one was 20 years. So this level of standardization doesn't mean something extraordinary happened there. We just had this tiny fraction of time, and of course that they're going to be more standardized. But the existence of different types in this small time frame, and then the existence of two different cultural groups, so to say, that were already proved to stick with their technological signatures in other forms of production, like pottery production, this was something that was the biggest hit, in my opinion. So these conical spindle whorls really look like something that was a foreign influence.
Okay, the technology is linked to a foreign influence. What does that say about the spread of wool production in the Neolithic?
Well, that's a really tough question, which I don't think it's going to be really answered ever, no? But we have opinions and interpretations. No? The fact is that we know that spindle whorls were not only used for spinning. No? All these flat spindle whorls that were there, we can connect them even more to plying, because the majority of the plant fibers that got preserved, like threads that were made out of either tree bast or linen, they were largely spliced and then plied. And the one spindle whorl that is published in a paper in the publication There was also plant fiber, best fiber, and this was applied thread, and the spindle was evidently used for plying. Now the question is, what came first, egg or the chicken? Was this tool invented for plying or was it invented for spinning? This is really like one of those questions that I don't think will ever get answered. But the fact is that the tool is so flexible. We see also how it changes proportions and shape and how it can be better suited for this or that. And this is the biggest advantage of every technology that we have that really got propelled. And that's why spindle wheels are still used today, I think, in certain areas, because it's such a efficient but flexible tool that can be adjusted.
But what's the factor about spindle whorls that enables wool or animal hair to be spun?
The fact is that for really like very short fibers like wool or other animal fibers, you really need a faster tool. So I think connecting faster tools to shorter fibers is something that makes sense to me. It's logical. No? The two sites also have a lot of data, either zoo or archaeological, botanical, particularly their data on sheep demography was indicated that early wool could have happened there. So this is another fact that contributes to the idea that these faster tools developed at one point to be used for shorter fibers. Now the question is, what happened first? Did this tool get appropriated from plying? Was it then used for spinning, adjusted for spinning, or it was originally used for spinning and then was adjusted for plying? This is something I have problems deciding on my own. I don't think it's such a clear-cut evidence that we have thus far. I think that is the main beauty of the tool, that it's so flexible, and the technology, and that's why it's so hard to say what actually happened first and how people share this technology and transferred it for their own needs or their own resources of preference.
Does it mean that the volume of textile production intensified?
The settlements were not just experimenting, I think, with textile technology. The amount of data that was found there, and this is only tools that were left behind, So this is a huge amount of tools. We see that textile was present in every household, basically all the time. Every spare time that they had was definitely used for textile production. And I think the big portion of their work day was actually designated for textile production. And on both of the sites, several different materials were being used simultaneously, for sure. The level of preservation that is just like unprecedented. But the amount of textile tools that were left there speaks in favor that they were very intensely working on textiles.
So you continue to research the development of technology, Anna, but I think you've got some new interests now.
I was always interested basically how technologies develop, how they change, how they spread, what's the connection between technology and economy, because we see all these technological developments. Economy is what dictates the level of adoption they're gonna have, and then ecology, the implications. And I think these are some of the topics that are currently becoming very important due to climate. This project that I was looking into, the spread of sheep wool, so I was lucky enough to collaborate with other scientists investigating the deforestation and climate change connected to this process that started. And currently I'm trying to look at renewables, and I'm very interested in cryptocurrencies. These are two things that are now, for me, the most intermediate examples where I can ask the same questions that I always have and see it happening real time, How does the adoption happen? What are the factors that push the technology, how it develops? What are the factors that prevent it? I think we as a discipline failed there a lot, because I think prehistory has a lot to teach us actually about these things, and I think we fail to make the comparison with ongoing things. No?
Thank you very much for talking to me, Anna Grabungio. All the papers we've talked about today are detailed on the website. So that brings us to the end of this episode of Foreign Countries. Join me next time for another conversation.